Thank you very much, Ken-san. It's such an honor to be here and to be the first speaker of this series this quarter. Let's start. I came to Stanford in 2001 as a graduate to join the business school. And before Stanford, I was a boring banker from Tokyo. And however, after spending 2 years on this campus, I had a transformational experience to pursue my passion to be an entrepreneur. Today, I would like to talk about the importance of entrepreneurship, how it drives economic growth, how it helps innovation, and how technology makes our life better. Then speak about a little bit about my country, Japan, some signs of my emerging spirit of entrepreneurship, and how that's changing how big companies behave in this changing market. So with that, a little bit of introduction, as Ken-san already described, but I was a graduate from Tokyo University. I joined one of the big banks in Japan, and I came to the United States to join Stanford Business School. After that, I was a partner at one of the Sandhill venture capital called Dole Capital Management, DCM. And this January, I started a firm called Will, which I would explain my activities later. So to kick off this presentation, I would like to start with a story of an English teacher. I'm sure a lot of people in this room knows who this is. So, a gentleman standing, with his arm, I don't know why he had to stretch his arm, but talking to his 17 friends in his house in Hangzhou. So he was a former English teacher in Hangzhou. He started a company in his apartment. His name is Jack. There's a wife in that picture and 17 friends. They all put up their savings to start a company. Chinese company that can compete in a global market. They contributed $60K. At this company, 15 years later, so company was founded in 1999. 15 years later, 2 Fridays ago, September 19th, this company went public on New York Stock Exchange. It was the largest IPO in the history of the United States. Actually, history of, entire history. 227 billion. I don't know how I should count this, but to give you the idea, this is a larger, market cap is bigger than Toyota today. So this company is called Alibaba. Maybe a lot of people may have heard about it. And I wanted to start with this story since this is a story of a former English teacher starting a company with his friends 15 years ago. 15 years later, he created an e-commerce empire, which is valued more than Toyota today. And this one of the examples how entrepreneurship mindset could create a huge economic impact where it doesn't matter where you came from and what you do today. It's all about your passion and your spirit to change the world. And if you stack up Alibaba against some of the well-known high-tech companies, it's already, above Facebook and Oracle and Samsung and Intel. And a lot of people heard about Alibaba, but when you see this picture, you realize how big this company is. So entrepreneurship is so important. Look at these logos. I'm sure most of you in this room must be the user of these technologies. These are all born in Silicon Valley. That's why we should care about entrepreneurship and startups. So now let's step back and talk a little bit about why do we need startups. Let me start with some numbers. So this number means less than 0.2% of something becomes 21%. And so 0.2%. So this represents a annual venture capital investment in the United States. Compared to GDP of the United States, it's less than 0.2%. It's actually about 0.1% right now. But it's creating over 20% of GDP value. What does it mean? With a small investment, it creates huge economic value to our society. And this is why I wanted this topic matter to us, that when you have a mature country looking for growth, venture is one of the few areas that you can drive a huge growth in your economy. Let's look at a different number now. So 0.2%, now you know what this number is, becomes 11%. So now this is, venture-backed startups. If you add a job created by venture-backed startups, it equals roughly 11%. Again, these numbers could change a little bit, but the point is, with small investment, is creating a lot of jobs. And this is another point that we discussed a lot about. When we talk about high-tech industry, people say, oh, it doesn't create a lot of jobs, it doesn't replace traditional industries. But when you really look at the numbers, it's not, it's not necessarily what people think. It is actually creating a lot of jobs for us. And what do these jobs look like? Again, this is just an example of some of the public information that I could acquire. So Googling, the numbers on the left-hand side of each logo are the number of employees when these companies went public. On the right-hand side, these are the numbers of current employees based on their website. So obviously, companies like Home Depot, Starbucks, with a lot of shops, no surprise, it creates a lot of jobs. But even Apple and Google, it creates meaningful job, particularly in this Bay Area. So to encourage more entrepreneurship, to build the next Google, the next Facebook, it really adds a lot of employment opportunities and makes our community very vibrant. So now let's look at some different stats. So these are a number of companies and a dollar spent by each corporation with the logo this past 15 years on M&As. What do you mean by M&A? So you think about Cisco, Oracle, Microsoft, Google, they can do everything by their own. They have infinite amount of money, they have a lot of employees. But the reality is these companies acquire these companies, these startups, to make, to keep innovation going. For instance, Google, just looking at some of the reported stats, acquired more than close to 30 companies already this year. Facebook, I think 15 or 20 this year. So Google, who everyone thinks have so many services, in fact, they're the most aggressive acquirers of these startups. And that is driving their innovation, and that makes this Silicon Valley community very, very exciting. So another angle to look at this is, these innovation led by startups changes how we live. Now, I listed some of the services or companies or products that didn't exist just 10 years ago. And, when I say 10, yes, it's 10 years ago. And I often forget that how I started was by really ugly cell phone, but now everyone uses smartphone, I guess, in Stanford campus. And everyone is so used to looking at Tesla, which is not a common car anywhere in other parts of the world, but in Silicon Valley, Tesla is everywhere in Safeway and Trader Joe's, and it feels very awkward, but this is a very special place. And everyone uses Gmail for their emails, and everyone is on Facebook, I guess, to communicate with your friends, to find your old friends from 30 years ago. And but none of these technology existed 10 years ago. So, we should realize how powerful these startups are to change our lives easier, better. And, but because of these tools, we get to meet people that you would never have met if these didn't exist. So what do you think is going to happen 10 years from now? Here are the technologies that could potentially happen. You don't have to wait maybe 10 years. Maybe in 5 years, these things will be available. One in the upper corner here, the cute little car is a self-driving car by Google. This actually car doesn't have a driver. So basically, if you tell this car to go to this place, this car will ship your kid to your soccer field, or this car will go to your daughter's school to pick up them at high school. And it could change how, I guess, a lot of your wives spend their time, driving their kids and spending so much time just, chauffeuring a lot of part of their life, I guess. Another example is this flying drones. It looks like a helicopter, but this is already, in the field testing by, UPS and FedEx. Think about these helicopters flying into your front door and dropping a medicine when you need right now. This technology is already available, and we're waiting for some regulatory changes and in the best use case, and obviously it has to be a viable business to keep going. Obviously, space traveling is close. Also these sensor devices that can tell you whether you're healthy condition or not. There's so many technologies that people dreamed about, which is already very close to being real. And again, these technologies are not necessarily driven by big companies. It's driven by, sometimes by few individuals with entrepreneurial spirit. Oftentimes, it's a lot of people from this campus, I guess. So just to summarize all the data I just showed you, it was to make a point why we need startups in our community. It creates a lot of economic value, as I mentioned. It creates jobs. And also it accelerates innovation, and it adds a lot of pressure to big companies because big company needs to innovate and drive the economy as well. And finally, it transforms how we live our life. So now, let's look at this data relative to the situation in Japan, and talk a little bit about how Japan can be more entrepreneurial, since that's a big topic that Professor Kenji is also working on today. And I want to start with some stats here as well. So now, $0.7 billion versus $39 billion. So $0.7 billion, $700 million. This is, if you look at how much venture capital invested in startups this past 12 months, in Japan, $700 million was invested, while US, and more than half of this is in Silicon Valley, $40 billion. So it's 57x gap. It's a simple math. There's a big gap between how much risk money is provided in Japan and how much it is spent here in the United States. And also in US, there is a very convenient set of people called angels. A lot of them live in this area, and they spent about $20 billion almost every year to fund these startups. So if you add that up in the $39 billion, again, simple math, not super accurate, but you would see 90x gap between the risk money provided to Japanese entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs who comes to Silicon Valley or United States. So there's still a huge gap, I guess. So the next stat, $400 billion, $19 billion, these numbers are too big. I don't even know what that means. But so $400 billion, this is a market cap of Google 2 weeks ago. And $90 billion, this is numbers total of all the internet companies in Japan, very famous ones. And I think I chose companies with over $1 billion market caps. So basically big companies that a lot of Japanese have heard of or know or hear about. But if you add all these companies, the Google, one company, is so much bigger than these companies that represent Japan. So when you live in Japan, you think Yahoo Japan or Rakuten, they dominate the entire tech space, or they are the largest company that you can even think of. But once you come to the United States, you see a behemoths like Google that can easily buy entire companies on this list, and that's still again a gap between U.S. and in Japan in total. So now a different stat: $430 billion and $90 billion. So $90 billion, the same number, all the tech companies that represent Japan today. Now, a lot of people say Google is unfair because it's an anomaly. Those companies only emerge once every 1,000 years. So I took out Google, forget Google, and let's see the companies that are formed after year 2000. Again, clean number. It's not even 15 years yet. Very young companies. If you add all the market cap of these companies in this logo, it adds up to $430 billion, which is beyond Google. And again, I just wanted to remind you that Google is not the only one. We're seeing a lot of companies who is chasing after Google, who's making a huge impact in our community. And one day, I think one of these companies will become a huge business that would impact all of us in this room. Okay, now, going back to another number, $400 billion and $890 billion. Google, okay. Now, if you add the top 10 market cap companies in Japan. I'm glad that Google is smaller than this. I would be very ashamed. By the way, I would not be standing here. It's going to be so hard to make you excited about Japan if this number was smaller. So I'm glad. So, but, these are traditional companies, Toyota, Honda, NTT, KDDI, banks. These are companies that existed, I don't know, forever, I guess. Not new companies. So, Google, one company, Google cannot compete with them. So now let's look at a different number. So top 10 companies in Japan today, traditional companies. Now, if I cut off this market cap line at 1995, which is the year when Netscape went public and Yahoo went public, the starting of the internet era in the United States or in the world. When you add the market cap, it beats all the best companies in Japan. So I don't know, it's $1 trillion, I guess. And this is the power of startup. And again, let's not forget that these companies didn't exist 20 years ago. These are relatively young companies, and a lot of them are started by Stanford students, and a lot of them are started by non-tech people. And it's always amazing. Everyone thinks startup is only available for people with high IQ and great grades, and all the people who can program computers and know about a lot of semiconductors, but it's not. Anyone in this room can be one of one of the entrepreneurs who can lead these companies like that. So another different stat, slightly different from our previous slides. So in Japan, the previous stats would say, well, there's a lot of big companies in Japan. That means there must be a lot of dollars, and obviously a lot of venture capital dollar was spent in the United States. So even though I'm trying to encourage entrepreneurship in Japan, how do I finance them? What are the sources of capital to drive these innovations? And when I look at the stat, so R&D budget that big companies in Japan spends every year. So this is a budget that was posted on Nikkei for the budget for 2013. Toyota is spending $9 billion a year, almost every year, on R&D. Again, a lot of them are, building their current cars, remodeling cars, and I'm sure some part of that is spent to, create their version of Tesla electronic vehicle or hydrogen power cars. But the problem is, like this picture, describes, a lot of the research projects are all sourced to their purpose, and it's all spent internally. And it's, technical, it's called closed innovation style. Basically doing everything by their own, spending every dollar for yourself, not for M&A or not for investing into startups. So when I look at these numbers, I said, geez, Japan has a lot of money. All these big companies who I think is all dead or really screwed up has so much money to spend, yet their just mindset is so narrow. And how, I wish they were spending even 1% or 5% or 10% of this budget into helping startups or acquiring companies, because that would allow them to accelerate their innovation and then come up with cool products. Because they, I think a lot of people in this room know these brands, and they still have a lot of brands with a lot of history and legacy. But, these, legacy is diminishing very fast today. Okay, let's look at now different stat. So, I'm here to talk about entrepreneurship and why it's important. And I happened to do a same speech, same day, about 14 hours ago in Tokyo. I just landed today in San Jose. And I was making the same speech to a different university in Japan. But, in Japan, everyone is interested about entrepreneurship. But when you look at this stat, okay, business school where I graduated. So percent of graduates in 2006, not 10 years ago, but long ago, who went to the tech and entrepreneur sector was 20%. Today, as we know, Silicon Valley, it's a lot of hype and excitement around entrepreneurship. everyone wants to become an entrepreneur from this number. I just had a 10-year reunion, I think 2 years ago. Obviously, who were there, more than half of the people in my classmate were entrepreneurs. So it tells how powerful the entrepreneurship, the spirit of entrepreneurship is in Silicon Valley. And also, I just listed Harvard. Also, people at Harvard wants to become an entrepreneur, which is quite surprising. I thought every Harvard people go to GE or IBM. So it's amazing that everyone in the United States wants to become an entrepreneur today. So let's look at Tokyo University, where people think that the best and brightest go. So 10%, 10%. And in fact, if I break down this number, it's majority. It includes tech and entrepreneur. So I think the number of entrepreneur is less than 1%. And despite all this excitement, the number hasn't changed much. So, this is why I want to think about how can we change the mentality of students, or how can I change the mentality of society to embrace entrepreneurship such that the number would look more like Stanford or Harvard in the next 10 years. I think if Japan cannot change how people think, Japan will never become a startup nation. So to summarize all the numbers I showed you, basically it goes to these 4 points. First of all, obviously a big gap in risk capital, lack of risk capital in the society, and lack of mega ventures. We think a lot of these Japanese companies are big and famous, but in terms of economic value, they're still very small relative to even one company like Google. And obviously, from some of the stats I showed you, Japanese big companies are very close relative to Silicon Valley. It's very open. We call it the open innovation style. So this closed corporate cultures really prevents startup emerging in the society. And finally, entrepreneurship. Joining entrepreneur, becoming an entrepreneur, or jumping into an unknown company is never encouraged or not respected. Even if you try to join a company after you graduate from Tokyo University, first of all, your parents going to go against it, and then your grandma is going to show up in your room and say, just don't go to this dinky startup and just go to Mitsubishi or Mitsui or whatever company that they know. And that's the reality of Japan today. Okay, so am I here to just talk about negatives? Not really. So I want to share a little bit about what I do day to day and what are the signs, bright signs that I see in the Japanese community today, which makes me believe that 10 years from now, Japan could look very different from what I showed. The first sign is the government. The government is trying to push entrepreneurship like crazy this time. It's not even like joke. It's just every Ministry of Economic Trade and Industries, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Communication, Ministry of Education, everyone is pushing entrepreneurship. Everyone is encouraging students to, young kids, to even, people in the mid-40s, mid-50s who are stuck in big companies, try entrepreneurship. There's not a lot of risk, but like you think. And that's a good thing. And government is going to support you financially and mentally, and as a facility, they're going to give you a lot of resource to do that. And I think this is a very promising sign. Bits and pieces of this happened in the past, but this time, a lot of our ministry are joining forces to push entrepreneurship big time in Japan. And it's sad. This should be led by private sector, by the way, but unfortunately, in Japan, since these big companies are really risk-averse, government, who I thought was the most conservative people in the world, is now becoming very aggressive, which is a good sign. And I think there's some people in this room who are from the government. Secondly, corporates are not dumb. There are some aggressive corporations who is trying to embrace corporate venture capital activities. The corporate venture capital, for those who don't know much about, so again, majority of the corporation, when you talk about innovation or entrepreneurship, they try to do all in-house. They fund their entrepreneurs. In Japan, in US, we call it entrepreneur. So entrepreneurial people in your big companies. They try to do everything on their own. But these companies that I listed are companies who set up a separate fund, a separate set up resource, or actually a place to host entrepreneurs and then help actually entrepreneurs to become a big company. And I think this is a new trend. In the past, these were done, in bits and pieces. Now we see enough critical mass of companies, including even TV stations like Fuji TV, Recruit, Itochu Mitsui, like big trading companies, Nikon, very traditional Japanese company. All of these companies have a corporate venture program where they're willing to invest, they're willing to provide technical support, they're willing to provide spaces. And I think this is a great sign that corporations are now at least trying to become a little more open than before. Another corporate trend, and we're seeing a lot more M&A activities. These are still, Rakuten, SoftBank, NTT. These are still companies that a lot of people in Japan think is very progressive thinkers. But again, if you look at the number of M&As they have done this past, I guess this one is 5 years, I'm sure a lot of people in this room is quite surprised. We think M&A is all done by Google or Facebook or all these Western Silicon Valley-based companies. So now, Japanese is coming back. I'm sure a lot of people were surprised when SoftBank, one of the Japanese carriers, acquired Sprint networks, and they even tried to acquire T-Mobile. So I think this trend will continue. Japan, with big companies' resource, now, with a strong leadership, is embracing entrepreneurship. And one way to achieve it is to acquire companies outside of Japan. Okay, another good sign in Japan. So these are startup companies. I'm sure a lot of people in this room have never heard about these companies. But I just picked companies who raised more than $10 million since 2013, so a little bit over a year. Why is it important? 10 years ago, when you talk about venture funding in Japan, it was always typically around $1 or $2 million. That was the big funding. Most companies would fund $500,000, $300,000, and then every investor would force them to go public after the financing event. So what does it mean? So when you have a venture funded with extremely small capital, when they go IPO in Tokyo Stock Exchange, oftentimes these companies' market cap are, $20 million companies. And you don't see a lot of companies above $100 million when they go public. And the problem about this approach is when you have a lot of small companies being listed, these companies lose a chance to grow fast. Because once you're listed, you're under a lot of scrutiny. A lot of analysts is going to ask you all kinds of questions. A lot of day trader is going to trade on your stock, and you have no flexibility to start something new. So when that was a traditional approach of funding startups, even though we see a lot of IPO numbers going up, it was all small companies, and none of them are even in my chart, my previous chart. So I was always talking about 10 years ago when I used to, I'm still doing this, but while I travel to Japan every month, I say, hey, startup needs to raise more money, and just wait before you go IPO. Just create a strong foundation such that even after you go public, you can take more risks and you can create jobs and you can be a $10 billion plus company. Because if you don't become a big company, it doesn't create a lot of social impact. And none of these big companies would even care about you. So these larger funding rounds, the increasing number of larger funding rounds, this is unprecedented in Japan, is an extremely good sign for a person like myself who is trying to create this venture ecosystem much more vibrant and dynamic. A few more slides. We're seeing a lot more entrepreneurs rising or becoming more visible in our community. Some people may not know, but founder CEO of Rakuten, Hiroshi Mikitani, he lives in Silicon Valley. Yeah, he has a house, huge house in Silicon Valley. He's going to start living there half of his time very soon. Line is Morikawa Akira. This is most popular social network service in Asia today. DNA, game company, LifeNet, insurance company, Gunsi, news curation company, Mixi. One of the very first social network to go public. These people are becoming much more visible figure in Japan. And some of them are the idols, the role models for younger entrepreneurs who want to pursue entrepreneurship. Before them, we were still talking about Mr. Honda. I don't know when he was born, but and Morita, who started Sony, and it was not right in my mind. So another thing, again, I'm here at Stanford, so I have to put a lot of Stanford logos here. Startup founded by top university alumni. This is also very encouraging too. I graduated from Tokyo University. None of these companies existed. Now there's so many alumni from my school is starting these companies. Some of them are public, and some of them are big enough to create a very meaningful impact in the society. Not as big as obviously Stanford. Once again, if you look at Stanford, I'm sure everyone in this room must feel very good about this. You can be one of them very soon. So to summarize my data so far, so Japan's venture ecosystem is not dead, it's changing. And here are the positive trends. We're seeing a lot of government funding, and trying to push entrepreneurship. And we're seeing a lot of corporate venture activities. Obviously, a lot of companies are putting money into startups. And the other approach is M&A. Rakuten, SoftBank acquiring companies in Silicon Valley, acquire companies in Europe, which is a good sign of open innovation. And also startups, again, this is particularly important for us, like us venture capitalists, who is trying to help people pursue bigger companies. They're looking for a larger exit. We're seeing a lot of serial entrepreneurs who has done this before, who is successful, or who made a lot of mistakes in the past, but have a lot of lessons learned from that. And these people are coming into this entrepreneurship ecosystem. And that's a great sign of, if you think about what's going to happen 10 years from now, this is all great signs. And finally, entrepreneurs. Again, yes, your grandma and grandpa is going to try to stop you. But, entrepreneurship is becoming a cool thing, which is a good thing. So looking 10 years from now, what do we need? What do we need beyond all these good signs that I saw so far, I just presented so far? I think there are 3 areas that I'm trying to emphasize through my company, World Innovation Lab. One is leveraging resource in big companies. As I showed you in some stats, in Japan, yes, government has a lot of money, which is our tax money, obviously, but big corporations have a lot of savings from their success in the past. We need to unlock those capital. We also need to unlock a lot of talents who are sitting inside of Sony, who are sitting inside of Toyota, because they're getting bored about where their company is going. And they have a lot of technologies that are hidden in their closet, and they never give it to anyone. I think we need to unlock these 3 elements, talent, technology, and capital that is sitting inside of these big corporations. And secondly, again, when people talk about entrepreneurship, in Japan today, a lot of entrepreneurs approach this venture ecosystem as if it's the shortest way to become rich very fast. That's not the right approach. By doing it, as a means of becoming rich, people want to go IPO fast. Therefore, the company is not going to be big. It's not going to be there a long time, and it doesn't really create any reasons in the society. We need to see more mega ventures, big companies that is trying to impact the society, big ventures who is trying to solve the issues that we face today. And I think if we cannot build these new form of ventures, I think Japanese venture ecosystem will be irrelevant to the global market 10 years from now. And finally, I'm trying to change in the business setup, but fostering entrepreneurship mindset in the entire society, including our kids, including even teachers, including politicians, that has to eventually happen in a community to make sure that entrepreneurship is everywhere in Japan. So I started a company called World Innovation Lab, this January. So I'm still a startup today to actually drive these 3 points that I just made earlier. So our mission is to drive open innovation, large corporation. So again, open innovation is a style where big companies try to embrace entrepreneurship. If you want to build a cool product, Don't do everything by yourself. Bring in cool entrepreneurs. Work with other companies. Work with the younger people at Stanford. That's how you come up with cool technology and new services today. Secondly, educating entrepreneurs to think big. This is a big theme in Japan. As I mentioned earlier, in Japan, a lot of people approach entrepreneurship to become rich quick. Again, not everyone, but a lot of them think that way. We have to, people like myself, who is here to help as a venture capitalist trying to help entrepreneurs, have to push the boundary. Don't go public too soon. If you go public, you have to be big enough to make a meaningful impact in the society, to create jobs, and be respected by the society. Otherwise, being public, you're going to have a miserable life. You got to be under a lot of scrutiny. SEC is going to chase after you. And oftentimes they screw up and they go up and they end up being in the jail. So I say it's not worth it. So entrepreneurship education is extremely important. And thinking big is what is missing in Japanese entrepreneurship ecosystem. Thirdly, promoting entrepreneurship in the society. Again, I talked about this, how many hours ago? I forgot, 15 hours ago in Japan. A lot of people said, again, forget it. Education system in Japan is so anal. It's just so hard to move. Even changing a one word in textbook is going to take 10 years. Again, just forget it and move on. That's a good thing. No one's going to try this. So I hope I can try this. It's going to take a lot of time and energy. But if I can't change how people think, even school teachers, our kids, think about how they live their life, my mission is not going to be successful. So to do these three things, I went after all these companies in this logo here, Sony, Nissan, A&A, airline company, telco company, NTT, Mizuho Bank, where I came from, Daiwa Securities, Hakodo, advertisement company, JVC, audio company, Mitsukoshi, retail, department store, credit card company, educational company. I told them, hey, I want to change. I want to make these changes in Japan. I want to change how you guys drive innovation in your organization. Invest in my company, and I will help you achieve that. So as of now, these are my partners who invested close to $350 million into my company. So they obviously invested a huge check in my company as a capital. And if I were a traditional venture capital, I stop there and I just run to invest and try to invest and make money and try to become rich. That's a traditional venture capital. But I said, I'm going to do two more things. One is talent. You guys have a lot of talent in your company. They're looking for something new. Otherwise, they're going to leave and they're going to join Apple. They're going to join Google. That's a waste of your resource. You trained them and they were happy employees at Sony. And why are you letting them go to your competitors? Instead of doing that, have them come to my office. I will help them change their life and drive innovation. And hopefully, those proceeds would go back to these organizations. And I said that's a much better use of people, even though they still leave to Google, by the way, which I think a lot of them will. I want to create another system to recycle these people who has a lot of value, who has a lot of skills, and who has a lot of entrepreneurship mindset. And so that's what I'm also doing here in Silicon Valley. So I have an office in University Avenue, just right across the street from Stanford, in the corner building, where I host expats and also short-term interns from these corporations, since they're my investors and major partners to drive this project. And thirdly, I also said, by the way, you guys have so much technologies that are sitting in these shelves. And I wonder why you guys are not using it. And I said, oh, I can't, this is our IP. We're paying loyalty every year, but we don't know what to do with it, but we don't want to give this to Samsung because they might make more money out of this. This is silly, by the way. They're spending hundreds of millions of dollars just trying to secure these patents, which doesn't create any value. These are all cost for big companies like Sony or NTT or A&A or like Nissan. And I said, this is silly. If I look at these prototype product or some product they think they failed 10 years ago, it has a huge value. Think of Aibo, which Sony introduced maybe about 10 years ago. It was a robot with a lot of intelligence into it. It was a dog robot which walks around your house, and you can talk to them, it moves. As you know, today in Silicon Valley, every robot company gets funded. A lot of venture capitalists on Sand Hill Road would throw you tens of millions of dollars just to fund these cool robot companies. When you go to Sony and say, hey, let's revive Aibo, they said, oh, we failed this project. We cannot revive this guy. So I said, okay, let's change the name, Bibo or, Saibo or whatever. I'll start a new company. You guys have a great technology and you still keep the IP. Why don't I spend that out and make a new cool startup in Silicon Valley, not even in Tokyo? That's what I call carve out. It's not just about Sony. Every big company, even in US, must have a lot of hidden stuff in their closet. I want to unlock them such that these new cool technologies, which are built by these engineers, creates a social impact. So what we do at Will, we have these funding and support from these big corporations. We claim ourselves as a change agent for these big companies. We drive their innovation. We drive their entrepreneurship. And the business we do are three things. One is we call it investment. This is basically acting as their corporate venture arm. My ideal goal is Sony or these companies to do corporate venture capital program internally, such that they can work with startups directly. However, a lot of my partners never done these activities, so they don't know anything about venture capital investment. So I'm acting as their proxy to help them potentially build in corporate venture program in the future. For the time being, they invest in me, and I invest in cool technology startups that could be relevant to each of my partners. The second part of business, we call it as a business creation. This is some project that I just mentioned, spinning out some of the assets, or even incubating a business together with some of my partners. Incubation is really hot still in Silicon Valley, and a lot of, even Stanford has incubation program from StartX off campus, and I think it's a great thing. But the problem about incubation from scratch is it just takes so much time, and it's not very easy. The success ratio of incubation is very low. So I said, well, these big companies already have a people with 15 years, 20-year experience building semiconductors, building softwares. Why don't I incubate with them? They have all the technical capabilities. They just don't know how to package it as an independent business. Or sometimes they're just not aware about how much value they have. So my team at Will go into these big companies, identify some of the technologies or engineers who has an entrepreneurship mindset, and I spun that out. And I fund those projects through our fund and try to create a viable independent business. And that's what we call business creation. And the third part is I call it education. So my ultimate goal is to make these companies independently successful as a company that is driving innovation. Right now, I partner with them to help them create these venture program internally. So for the next 10 years, because of this funding, I'm trying to educate these employees who is lucky enough to come to our space, as an intern or expat, and do these activities, activity 1 and 2, corporate venturing activities to business incubation activity together with my team. And I think it's always better. And I'm hoping to send some students to Kenji-san to, become more entrepreneurial and use this Stanford campus to, brainwash them to become entrepreneurs, I guess. But I think ultimately education is most important for the long-term impact, because unless people change their mindset, nothing really happens. So this is kind of how my company's vision is. I have an office here on University Avenue, and also office in Tokyo, Roppongi in Tokyo, and trying to connect this large corporation world to the startup ecosystem. And by connecting these dots, I hope I can stimulate this Japanese entrepreneurship ecosystem, so that again, 10 years from now, a lot of the numbers and stats that I show you would look very different. So finally, I would like to end my speech with one marketing ad, which I really like, which I wanted to share with you. And without more words, let's start.
Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. While some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
So I hope people in this room is crazy enough to change the world. Thank you very much.
I really like Will's idea, the ideal to make Japanese innovation very strong. And this may not be his really point that he would like to talk, but he mentioned about government role. And Japanese government role is very strongly pulling out money, but this is a major difference between Silicon Valley and Japan. So I really want to know what the government should be in Japan instead of just pulling out money, giving out money, which may not be working well, I think. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the point Matsuo-san was making was in Japan, again, government is becoming aggressively supportive of entrepreneurship is a good thing. But I think for a lot of public people's mind, it looks like government is just throwing money at everything, which could end up becoming a major disaster of loss in our tax dollars. So what do you think is the ideal way for government to support entrepreneurship in Japan? So in an interesting way, I had the same question from my previous speech in Japan. Everyone says, oh, government is just doing way too much, and they're just going to lose all the money, and they shouldn't be coming into the entrepreneurship. I think, ideally, once again, I said, private sector should be driving innovation and pushing and providing more risk money. But since Japanese corporation, despite they talk about open innovation, they talk about what do we do with all these cash that we accrued over tens of 20s of years, no one is taking risks. Obviously, it has to do with how these ranking system in Japan works. CEO, every CEO gets kicked out every few years, and they don't want to take risks to make that period shorter. So that's the fact. What I proposed to the government people who were in my room in the previous when I was in Tokyo is that I think government support is good, but government just throwing money at startup is not a good idea because they never. There are all people who never done business. They don't know anything about entrepreneurship, and they don't even know who are the good entrepreneurs. So what happens? They all throw money to people who basically, approaches, who are friends of government officials, who looks good, which are not necessarily the best entrepreneurs in my mind. So what is a good solution? I told the government official who asked this question that the government should still, be part of this risk money ecosystem. However, it should be at least matched by the private sector money. So if the startup comes to the government and asks for $10 million investment, at least he or she should get funding for private venture capital or corporations, at least 10 million or 20 million, so the government can match 100% or half of the money that they actually got from the private sector people who knows about business. But if the government is throwing money at people who cannot raise money from these private sectors, you're doing something completely wrong. That's what I told them. And unfortunately, that is what's happening in Japan today. So I really need to stop this from becoming a disaster. So I think government support is good, but eventually their role should diminish very fast. But for the time being, this is a chicken and egg problem or catch-22. If there's not enough risk money, they can become the first step, but eventually it has to be covered by the private sector. He was first.
big and small companies in Japan, and my experience, I totally agree with you that Japanese just don't like risk, no risk money, that makes sense.
Yeah.
At the small companies though, all the risk ended up being burdened on the shoulders of the founders. So the funders, the VCs that funded, like, have low risk. The burden was really on the founders, their personal, I don't know, their car,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So it looks like you got a business model which is fantastic. It's refreshing because it's a lower risk. It looks like it's lower risk for companies to get together
That's
and
right.
use you.
Yes.
Do you offer better term sheets than companies in Japan would get from traditional
Yes,
VCs?
a couple of activities that we're doing is to try and certain these bad business customs, like you said. Every time a mid to small size business gets funded, oftentimes the CEO, the founder, everything that he or she has get collateralized. Even your kids' say, education, school savings and everything. It's just a disaster. I've seen so many bankrupted friends who are very unhappy. So first step, government actually is going to make those very strict those collateralization illegal. So that's a good thing. So a lot of people can take risk without risking entire fortune or asset you have today. That's a good thing. And also venture capital term sheet. I said these stock buyback plans and these silly terms that put a lot of load onto the entrepreneurs. I said we're going to get rid of those things, and we're going to make that an industry standard. And obviously, I'm going to have to fight with traditional VCs, but that's how Silicon Valley entrepreneurship is encouraged. Venture capitalists take the risk, and if we lose money, we move on. We're not going to try to chase after the entrepreneur until he gets miserable, and that's a very wrong approach. They should have a second chance. They should have a third chance. They should have a 10th chance. That's the healthy entrepreneurship, in community. So these things are changing. I think regulatory people know about these issues, and as we are trying to do the right thing.
In the U.S., most venture funds get investment from LPs that are pension funds, places that are really focused on return on their investment.
Yeah.
Your investors seem to be primarily corporate. Do they have a different motivation or have different expectations around return and more that they're asking for as an LP in your fund, or how are you dealing with that?
That's a great question. So yes, traditional venture capitalists, where I used to work for 10 years, there are three sources of fund. It's fund of funds, who are people who collect a lot of money from high net worth individuals, basically rich peoples, and allocate to a lot of assets. Second one is pension fund, like Dow Jones, GE. These big corporations have a pension program for their employees. Third one is endowment, like Stanford. Stanford Management Company has a huge fund to invest in venture capital. These three people, in a short way, they only care about returns, right? They invest you $1. If you get $3 back, they're happy, and they're going to keep your financing. Corporate investors are very tricky. Like my previous firm used to avoid corporate investors. I guess most of the Sand Hill Road VCs avoid corporate investors because money is not their priority. They always ask for business synergies or strategic value, which I don't really know what it means. Obviously, they want to know more about startups. They want to get meaningful information that they feel it was beneficial. And these are tricky because as a venture capitalist, you're dealing with these startups who want to do things in a stealth mode, or they don't want to share too much information because they always fear, what if they copy the business model or they copy the technology and run away? So it doesn't work. So from my 10-year experience, there must be a healthy mechanism to bridge between these startup ecosystem big companies. And that's why I strategically focused on this corporate money instead of pension money, which in some cases is easier because as you're a good fund manager, they would throw money at you without asking a lot of questions, without asking a lot of your time. But the reason I asked corporate money is because this project is not about building a huge fund. This project is all about educating people and spinning out these technologies or invested know-hows in these big companies and unlocking them. Again, everyone in this room must know, everyone might think it's impossible because these big companies have so many corporate walls, but I'm trying it, and it's been 10 months, and I see some signs of success. So I hope I can keep on doing this for 10 years and see what happens. Oh,
So you're saying that you want to unlock the corporate technology within larger
Yes.
Japanese corporations?
yes.
Who do you find to actually do the spin-off work, like the technology development, stuff like that? Because I imagine that if you invest in other startups, those startups are busy with their own jobs.
Yes.
So they're not going to want to work on other projects.
Yes.
So who does that kind of legwork?
Who does the legwork after you spin out? Oh, that's a great question. So technical expertise often comes from these tech companies, manufacturing companies like Sony or Nissan. And then whoever runs business will be perhaps you, which we recruit. So as a what we're doing on the other hand, while we negotiate the spin out, we're also huddling the management team who will be leading these technologies, these tech companies. So when you're in the process, oftentimes our team will be acting like a CEO of these projects. And while we were talking, and this spin-out discussion, as you can imagine, takes a lot of time because the legal department is going to come in, intellectual property department is coming, and lastly, human resource department say, I can't let this guy go out, because this is a star engineer, and I can't give you this guy. I have to deal with all these corporate, hurdles. But while I do that, I go out and recruit people who can run this business as a management team. So that's another layer of business that I didn't elaborate today.
Can I just add one question?
Yes.
So then who gets the equity of that? So that's a spin-off company.
Yeah.
Is that all corporate equity, or is that divvied up amongst
Yeah, that's a great question. So as a structure, I finance these projects. So as we become the largest equity holder, and the originator of this technology owns some portion of it. And I'm hoping I issue stock option or sub-incentive to the people who is going to join this entity.
So Jen, that was an amazing presentation and actually gives you a lot of hope. I've visited Japan. It's amazing to see there is a tremendous creative spirit that's there. But in the last couple of years, I've noticed, I've hosted a couple dozen Japanese friends in my home in Palo Alto who have come to visit and experience Silicon Valley. And one of the questions that a few of them have brought up over and over again is that in Japan we have such an amazing culture around meticulous engineering, around really special design, and how do we preserve the things that make Japanese great while also making a transition to a more risky or risk tolerant, I should say, society. And a great example would be there's a book that was written by James Fallows called More Like Us. And it was written in response to a lot of Americans in the 1980s thought Japanese companies are being so much more successful than we are. How can we be more like them? And James Fallows said Japanese companies to be great have to take what's great about Japan and make it better. We can learn from each other. And Americans need to take what's great about America. So what can you do to preserve that special culture in Japan, and while still bringing this culture, the risk culture of Japan?
That's a great question. I hope I know the answer to it, but let me try to answer it. So there are a lot of elements we don't know about Japan. So I was looking at, when I have time, I look at my Facebook feeds, and one feed that I looked recently, only I think 77% of Japanese don't even have a passport. So you realize Japan is very, we see a lot of Japanese on Stanford campus, and all we see, every Japanese must be traveling a lot, but the reality is very few Japanese even have overseas experience. Let's say if that number is true, within that 20-some% of people need to be entrepreneurial in my mind. It's not about entrepreneurship mindset is important. I wish every Japanese is born to try something new and think differently than what it is today, but whoever is going to lead the society as a strong entrepreneur like Son-san from SoftBank, I don't think we need hundreds of people. We just need maybe 5 more Son-san. That's what I told in the previous speech. We talk about, we need thousands of people to become a huge, big entrepreneur. I said, forget it. It's not going to happen in our culture. We just need very few people to make our society more exciting and dynamic, such that young people have hope. And again, my point was not to ask all people in Sony to jump out of Sony and start new companies. They can still be part of Sony, but they need to think differently. They just have to become an entrepreneur, and not go to office every day and sit and ask, what should I do today to spend my next 9 hours? And that's what's killing these Japanese corporations. So I think my ideal goal is, hopefully there is at least a top-level management. There are limited number of board seats, obviously, in big companies. These people need to change the mindset. if they are willing to take risk, even though some of the projects they may take on could shorten their life as a CEO, I think that's, they have to think, I did something new, and I got kicked out from the CEO seat, but I don't regret it because I give it a shot. I just want to create a corporate culture that even though these big company executives make a big bet on new things and fail, some parts of the society would appreciate those challenges. And I may ask them to become a CEO of my startup. So I want these people to be kicked out, actually, by taking risks. So that's kind of my thinking right now.
Hi,
Yes.
it's Farrar Samani. I'm an adjunct professor. You had mentioned it would be great if some of the children would be brought up with this innovative entrepreneurial mindset. Could you speak to education and how educators
Yes.
could actually steer some of that mindset change?
Yeah. So again, if you think about changing the education system per se, I think Silicon Valley has a great education, very entrepreneurial educational system. Even my kids live in Palo Alto and they all go to public school here. It's just so different from how kids are born and raised in public school in Japan. And if I try to change that, again, it's going to take probably 20, 30 years, or even forever to change it. So I said, what is the most effective way to change how our kids think about entrepreneurship? My answer today is to show them what it's, so the parents need to be changed. That was my first reaction. I said, I get asked by a lot of parents, how can I make my kid entrepreneurial? How can I make my kid go to Stanford? I said, you have to change first. You have to be an entrepreneur. You have to embrace risk. You have to do something new because all your kids are always looking at you. They're not looking at teachers every day. They're always looking at you, how you spend time, how you do things. And if you're always afraid of doing new things, if you're always afraid of, let's say, even wearing different clothes or even going camping, which you never have done, your kids is never going to take risk. You as a parent have to do things differently, do things, try new things, and that's how you make your kids entrepreneurial. And I think that's the most effective and most low-hanging fruit that a lot of people in this room may or may not know of. I think there is a lot of role that parents can play in this educational ecosystem. It's not about throwing them into Stanford campus. It's not about going to these tech camps in summer schools. I think it happens in your house. And it's not, and then hopefully these school teachers would understand how to encourage taking risks and how not to punish students who made mistakes. Because right now, a lot of Asian educational system is based on merit system. If you make a mistake, you get punished. If you're all A, you're a good student. And as long as that paradigm exists, it's going to be extremely difficult to encourage risk-taking or doing something different beyond your academic course, because everyone wants to get A, and if you cannot do anything beyond academics or anything that has nothing to do with your your grades, they're not going to spend any time on it. And I think changing that system, hope I can change it, but I think it's going to take time.
Thank you.
Yes.
Changing bankruptcy laws
Yes.
would be part of the solution,
Yes.
right? Because if bankruptcy laws are forgiving
Yes.
and open to or facilitating a restart, right, it's a different climate than if bankruptcy laws are unforgiving and penalizing, even criminalizing sometimes, like
Yes.
in Germany,
Yes.
and that doesn't really facilitate entrepreneurial growth.
I agree. So in fact, if you look at the legal environment today, Japan is one of the countries where bankruptcy process is one of the shortest in the world today. So the bankrupting company in Japan is becoming much more easier. It's almost identical to how bankruptcy is treated here. So from the legal point of view, it's almost the same. However, the society, how people look at you after you go bankrupt is completely different. You lose a lot of relatives, right? You lose a lot of friends. When you're successful, you find a lot of relatives who you never met. And that's kind of how it works today. So I hope that people's mindset would change over time.